John McManus is president of the John Birch Society and author of the book William F. Buckley Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment. It's a critical examination of the life and career of the conservative writer and editor. This talk from the Manchester City Library is about an hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, John F. McManus.
Thank you, Ward. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a delight to be in the live free or die state. I always like to start off programs with an attempt at humor, and I tell a story about the duck hunter. Some of you probably know about duck hunters. I've never done this, but I understand you get in a little boat and you're out on a cold and dreary day and you're waiting for ducks to come over and you shoot at them. I guess some people really like to do that. Well, anyhow, this one fella, he took out a friend on duck hunting. He'd never done it before. So they went out and they're sitting in the little boat, and all of a sudden the ducks come flying over, and he get out the shotgun and blam, and the duck comes floating down, and he says to his dog, "Fetch." And the dog walked out on the water, grabbed the duck, and walked back. The friend is looking at this. Well, more ducks, same thing. Blam, another duck comes floating down, and "Fetch." The dog again walked out on the water, grabbed the duck, and walked back. Well, finally, the man said to his friend, he said, "Did you notice anything different about my dog?" The guy said, "Yeah, he can't swim." Well, obviously, he missed the point. And part of my message here tonight is to say that a lot of people are missing the point, right? And we'll get to a lot of points as we go on here. The subject of the talk, of course, is Mr. William F. Buckley and my book called Pied Piper for the Establishment, subtitle. Now, let's begin by saying that for close to 50 years, liberals and internationalists from the New York Times and Time magazine and major radio and television networks, the academic world and elsewhere, have assured Americans that William F. Buckley is the nation's responsible conservative, as opposed to some other kind, I guess. He's the responsible conservative, the leader of America's right wing, and he's the voice of principled moderation in a world of political ideology. That's what they tell us all the time. Now, real conservatives should have been wary when leftists informed them who their leader was. It sometimes amazes me that good people will allow themselves to be provided a leader by those they instinctively oppose. A look at the Buckley record shows why the left has long saluted Mr. Buckley, and why Americans who care about personal freedom and national independence for their country should shun the favored opponent of liberals, leftists, and internationalists. Over the years, Mr. Buckley has supported a whole range of damaging initiatives and organizations, such as wage and price controls over business and industry, compulsory funding of increasingly deficient government education, foreign aid, the United Nations, a new constitutional convention, gun control, the UN's Genocide Convention, the Panama Canal giveaway, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. All of these Buckley has supported. He's also made major contributions toward the decline of our nation's morality and culture, such as writing for the slick, girly magazines, defending pornography, calling on the Catholic Church, in which he claims membership, to relax its anti-abortion stance as far back as 1966. That's 7 years before Roe versus Wade. He's provided dignity to the homosexual movement, and he's called for an end to laws against drugs. These are all specific acts he has taken that are harmful to our nation. They add up to the reasons why liberals, leftists, and internationalists applaud him as their opponent, their idea of a responsible conservative. In general, there are 7 Buckley achievements, which I don't consider real achievements, but 7 things that he can be labeled for that have earned him the plaudits of the establishment he has supposedly spent a lifetime opposing. Let me list them, 7 of them. First of all, and probably the most damning, He has substituted an undefined and constantly shifting to the left form of conservatism in place of the true standard for Americans, which is the Constitution of the United States. You will not find Mr. Buckley defending the Constitution, talking about the Constitution. Number 2 of these 7, he has supplied dignity and cover for the internationalists and world government promoters at the Council on Foreign Relations by publicly joining the organization and allowing his magazine to be used to shield its sovereignty-destroying agenda. Many people who have written to the Council on Foreign Relations or to a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and asked them why this organization does what it does and stands for what it stands for, get back a letter saying, well, how can you say that about us? We have all kinds of people in our organization. We even have Mr. William Buckley. And so he has supplied dignity and cover for them. Number 3, he used every means at his disposal to insist that conspiracy is not at the root of many of America's ills. He would have Americans believe that the extremely bright and talented people who have so woefully mismanaged America's affairs are bungling ignoramuses who never deliberately harm our nation. It just doesn't add up. Number 4, he supported individuals and programs favored by the internationalists, thereby sowing confusion in conservative ranks. 2 of the most prominent of those would be Henry Kissinger, his longtime friend, and even Nelson Rockefeller. Number 5, he contributed to the undermining of America's moral strength in many ways, as we've already mentioned. Number 6, he manufactured lies and distortions about the John Birch Society and its leaders, thereby persuading millions to refuse even to examine JBS publications. In effect, he appointed himself the guardian of the conservative movement's gate. He became the excommunicator of anyone on the right who did not accept his leadership. And he got lots of help in that regard from the establishment. And 7, he suppressed the desire for meaningful activism among a huge number of Americans. His effect has been to convince these concerned persons to lose gracefully their freedoms and their nation's independence to the ever more powerful establishment he officially joined in 1974. Following the Buckley path, you will find many people content to lose gracefully. I'm not in favor of losing, and I don't think you are here as well. Well, let me give you a little personal history about how I happened to start watching Mr. Buckley. In 1962, I was a subscriber to his magazine, the National Review. And it was during that period that the John Birch Society was in the headlines almost on a daily basis, being called a secret, fascist, un-American organization, like the Klan, like the communists, like the Nazis. Any nasty thing that could be said was being said about the John Birch Society. And I waited, I saw all this. I had an attitude at that point, it was a shame that something like this existed in my country. But I was reading National Review magazine and I didn't see anything in there. About a whole year after all of this started, and still William Buckley had said nothing. Finally, in early 1962, there was a 6-page editorial that he wrote that appeared in the magazine. And in it, he said there are a lot of good people in the John Birch Society, but what they ought to do is get rid of that screwball Robert Welch who's running it and get somebody else new. And I read that, and then I read it a second time, and it made sense to me because I really didn't know anything about the John Birch Society. So I wrote him a letter and thanked him for it, and lo and behold, they published my letter. Excuse me. After the letter appeared with my name and hometown under it, somebody in the John Birch Society looked me up in the phone book, wrote me a letter, and the question sent to me was simple. Are you basing your attitude about Robert Welch about what Robert Welch has said or what others have said of him? And I said, boy, that's a good question. I had never seen anything the John Birch Society had published, Robert Welch's writings. So I surprised this man. I wrote back and I said, if you have something that you think I ought to take a look at, I'll be glad to do so. My intention was to show him how wrong he was. It didn't work that way. Right? The more I read of the John Birch Society, the more I decided that there was something wrong here. These people are making sense. I got a hold of some of the books that they had brought back into circulation, books of the past that had been smothered and gone out of print. A book like I Saw Poland Betrayed by the man who was our ambassador to Poland at the time. A book called While You Slept while China was delivered to the Chinese communists. And some of these other books. I began to be grateful to the John Birch Society. But I didn't join the society. I didn't see that it was needed. I didn't have to join. I could be more effective on the outside, I said to myself, right? Well, finally, by 1964, I decided that was a foolish idea. So I joined the society. I became a chapter leader. And in 1966, they asked me to take a staff position. I did so, and I've never regretted it. That's 36 years ago. Well, so I was watching William Buckley way back in the 60s, long before a lot of other people were. And I began to say to myself, this man is harming the American movement. He's harming the people who want to know, the people who would like to know what the John Birch Society has said and what it does, and he was steering them away from it. He literally drove millions of Americans away from even taking a good look at the John Birch Society. Well, what about Mr. Buckley himself? What have I discovered about him? Well, he grew up in a family that could be considered the old right conservatives. His father was a very, very prominent oil man, and he brought up a large family and steeped them all in his own political philosophy, which could be called old right conservatism, non-intervention in the affairs of other nations, limited government under the Constitution, and so forth. So William Buckley was brought up in that tradition. In 1939, 1940, when he was about 15 years old, his family was part of the America First movement, working to keep America out of World War II, which had already begun in Europe. And young Buckley and his siblings put out their own little newspaper amongst the people in the community there in northwest Connecticut. Well, finally World War II broke out. William Buckley went through prep schools and so forth. And after, by the end of the war, he was about to be called into the service when he applied for and was accepted to OCS at Fort Benning in Georgia. He did get a commission in the United States Army, but by the time he got his commission, the war had ended. He never saw any combat. I don't fault him for that, certainly. And he left the military and entered Yale. 4 years in Yale, from 1946 to 1960, he became the editor of the school newspaper. And he caused a real stir on the campus by attacking many of the faculty and the administration itself for atheism and socialism that he saw there at the campus. And he eventually wrote a book about it called God and Man at Yale. And his book is a curious collection of attacks on different professors and different attitudes at Yale. But he even says in the book that it's okay if that's what the alumni wanted. And there's a departure from principle right there. It doesn't matter if you're standing for a principle, it doesn't matter how many people want it, the principle should still stand. Now, William Buckley continued to attack Yale and later on ran for a position on the board at Yale and lost out on that vote, but continued to talk to others about Yale's atheism and socialism and so forth. And then he sent his only son to Yale, which again seems a little bit hypocritical. Now, while he was a student at Yale, he became under the influence and tutelage of a professor named Wilmore Kendall. Kendall had been a Rhodes Scholar, and while he was in England in the Rhodes Scholar program, he became a Trotskyite socialist. Now, there are not too many people who know what that means. You might know what a socialist is. What's a Trotskyite? Well, if you go back to 1917, you knew that Lenin took control of Russia. But he did it with Trotsky. It was Lenin and Trotsky who succeeded in 1917 taking control of the nation of Russia. And they were partners. Well, Lenin died in 1924, and then emerged Stalin. And Stalin and Trotsky clashed. And they didn't clash over the goal of the communist movement, they clashed over the techniques to use to accomplish the communist goal. So much so that Trotsky eventually had to flee. He fled Russia, and he ended up in Mexico, where he was slain in 1940 by one of Stalin's henchmen. So Kendall was a Trotskyite, which meant that he was for a big government, he was for socialism on the domestic scene, and for internationalism and eventual world government. And that was Buckley's mentor. Now, Wilmore Kendall also had joined the OSS during World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, which in 1947 was converted to the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Now, those two organizations are looked upon by some as, well, we've got to have an intelligence agency, we've got to have good people doing this kind of thing. But if you study the CIA, especially, and the OSS before it, you find that it was loaded with communists. It was loaded with people who were undoing the American dream for others, and it was working to solidify communist control, communist domination of nation after nation after nation. In many cases, the OSS was dispensing money to fight against the Nazis in Europe and the Japanese in the Pacific, and they were financing organizations. They were financing all communist organizations. And there have been people from within the movement who came out to speak out about that. Same thing happened later with the CIA. While at Yale as well, Buckley was inducted into the Skull and Bones Society, the senior society at Yale that has weird initiation rites involving sexuality and reports about Nazism and so forth. The Skull and Bones Society is an entree to power and influence. If you know nothing else about it, consider that. It's an entree to power and influence. President George Bush, the elder, is a member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. And so is the current president, George W. Bush, a member of that. And some other prominent Americans you now hear being touted for the Democrat nomination in the next go-around for the presidency. A senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry, who is also a member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. And there now have been books written about this Skull and Bones Society. All I can say is that it's a secret organization, and when organizations are secret, they should be suspect. In fact, the Skull and Bones was the first of several secret organizations that William Buckley associated with. He himself became a member of the CIA, a very secretive organization. He became a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a secret organization where what goes on at their meetings is not, you're not allowed to talk about it. He became a member of the Bilderberger movement, which is another international secret organization. Well, I've already mentioned the fact that, excuse me, Mr. Buckley wrote a book called God and Men at Yale. He wrote another book called McCarthy and His Enemies, co-authored with his close friend from Yale, L. Brent Bozell. The two had formed a debating team, and they were very, very good at it, and they used to go into intercollegiate contests, and they usually won. They were very good debaters. Well, during 1953 and into 1954 and beyond, Senator Joseph McCarthy became quite famous. Every American knows the name. Not too many Americans know the full story about McCarthy. So Buckley and Bozell decided to write a book about McCarthy, and the book came out in 1954. When the manuscript was sent to Senator McCarthy's office, his staff read it, and they were very much opposed to the book. The senator's wife, Jean McCarthy, read it and became furious about it. One of anti-McCarthy reviewers who finally saw the book said that there were at least 63 criticisms of Senator McCarthy. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, later wrote about that book, and he said, "The man who invented the phrase damning with faint praise would have been very, very pleased with this book about McCarthy. Now, in my book, I go into what McCarthy stood for, the charges against him, and why he should be looked upon as an American hero, not as a devil. But I won't get into that because the subject is Buckley, not McCarthy. In recent years, a new edition of McCarthy and His Enemies has been published, and Mr. Buckley, interviewed about that, has stated that, yes, McCarthy was a very, very damaging influence in America. And he made the interesting comment that anything positive about McCarthy should be attributed to his co-author, L. Brent Bozell, not himself. Right? Well, L. Brent Bozell by now is already in his grave, and he didn't have a chance to respond. But L. Brent Bozell is somebody who, back in 1966, when Mr. Buckley came out and urged the Catholic Church to relax its position on abortion, condemned his close friend and former ally, William Buckley, and condemned him in very strident terms. And so did L. Brent Bozell's wife, who was Buckley's sister, condemned him as well for his stand on that. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here now. Let's go back to 1950. William Buckley has now finished 4 years at Yale, and the Korean War starts. He's very concerned about being called back into the military. So his friend Wilmore Kendall suggests that he join the CIA. That's a good way to avoid serving in the military. So he sends him down to Washington, where he meets a CIA official named James Burnham. Now, I should mention at this point that when they started the magazine in 1955, National Review magazine, the key people were, of course, Buckley, Wilmore Kendall, James Burnham, and Buckley's sister, Priscilla, all four of whom had CIA connections and CIA service. So there's a man named Murray Rothbard who joined the staff as a writer at the beginning of the National Review magazine and very quickly left. And he stated publicly that he thought that the National Review magazine was a CIA operation from the very beginning. He actually said that. So Buckley went to Washington, excuse me. He met James Burnham. I don't know what he learned about the CIA or OSS, its predecessor, but I've already mentioned the fact that it was loaded with communists. In fact, the head of the OSS during World War II was a general named Donovan. And Donovan boasted that he'd filled it with communists. He said, of course, I've filled it with communists. Those are the people that I need to go and to work with these communist organizations elsewhere that we're financing, right? And every leader of the CIA from the beginning, it started in 1947 when it was changed from the OSS, has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the one world government promoting organization that William Buckley himself eventually joined. Buckley has never told what he did when he was a member of the CIA in Mexico for a year. But while he was there, he wrote an article that appeared in a Catholic magazine called The Commonweal in 1952. And in that article, he said the following: "We've got to accept big government for the duration, through the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores." Now, this is the conservative leader, you see. He said, "We will have to support large armies and air forces, atomic energy, central intelligence, war production boards, and the attendant centralization of power in Washington, even with Truman at the head of all of it." Now, ladies and gentlemen, not too many Americans understand the term neoconservative. What is a neoconservative? A neoconservative is somebody who wants big government and who opposes communism, but is perfectly willing to have socialism. They are also internationalists. They love these economic unions. All of them have been promoting, excuse me, NAFTA, GATT, World Trade Organization, and now the new free trade area of the Americas. Excuse me. So here's William Buckley in 1952 taking positions that could hardly be considered conservative. And I maintain that if a lot of Americans knew about that 1952 article, even when they started the magazine in 1955, it would have been a different story. That article, excuse me, bears Trotskyism. That's exactly what Trotskyism is. Big government and centralization of power. And so here we have Kendall and Burnham, now the mentors of Buckley. And they themselves are both Trotskyites, just as Kendall was. Burnham was as well, a Trotskyite as a young man, moved into the OSS, moved into the CIA, ended up at National Review magazine. In 1996, the man who is widely regarded to be what they call the godfather of neoconservatism, a man named Irving Kristol, wrote a book. And in his book, he defined what neoconservatism is. In a very short sentence, he said, "We accepted the New Deal in principle and were very much opposed to isolationism." Well, isolationism is the latest pejorative, right? I don't consider myself an isolationist. I consider myself a non-interventionist. A non-interventionist with your son, your daughter, and your wallet. And I think most Americans respond to that. They don't really understand what they mean by isolationism. Well, you could say that George Washington was an isolationist. You could say Thomas Jefferson was an isolationist. You could say that many, many fine Americans over the years have said we should mind our own business. They're all non-interventionists, isolationists. And you will hear a lot of them today in these times. So neoconservatism means socialism. It means internationalism. It means the UN. It means NAFTA. It means the World Trade Organization. It means the free trade area of the Americas that they're now promoting, all of which William Buckley has supported. Buckley actually aided the neoconservative movement in great measure in 1991 when the neoconservatives wanted to have a program to introduce their thinking to Republican leaders. And so William Buckley arranged a meeting, and he got Republican leaders. They never named who these Republican leaders were, but Kristol wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal, another neoconservative journal. And in 1991, these Republican leaders came and they were introduced to neoconservatism, and Irving Kristol wrote about it, and he said they arrived as Republicans and they left as neoconservatives. And he was very happy about that. The neocons have taken over the Republican Party in our country. I don't think there's any doubt about it. A neocon is not a constitutionalist. A conservative today, the term has virtually lost its meaning. What does it mean today? I don't consider myself a conservative anymore. I used to. I now consider myself a constitutionalist. And I might admit to being a constitutional conservative, but a conservative only? No. Conservatives, according to Irving Kristol himself, conservatives have all become neoconservatives. So in 1955, William Buckley started the magazine. He'd gone around the country trying to enlist support from some famous and wealthy Americans. He went to a man named H.L. Hunt in Texas who said, "No thanks, I'm not interested." He didn't like the people that were surrounding Buckley. He had some insights way back then. Excuse me. He went to Colonel McCormick, the famous publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who was a mountain of a non-interventionist. And he too said to Buckley, "No thanks, I'm not interested." So they got going, and the magazine was just loaded with former Trotskyites, former OSS, CIA veterans, and other leftists and internationalists. In fact, some people who are favorable to Buckley say, isn't it strange that so many of these leftists and internationalists were part of the original founding of National Review magazine? But there was a need for a magazine that Buckley said he was putting together at the time. And so there was hope from many. I know that Robert Welch himself sent money to William Buckley to help him. And Robert Welch was not a wealthy man, as to put down a rumor about him. The magazine actually did some good at the beginning. And as Medford Evans, who was a man who was on the original masthead of the magazine and later left it to join Robert Welch in the John Birch Society's publications. As he once said, because he had done some good, he was in a wonderful position to do a lot of harm. And he certainly did. Now, I was working on the research for this book a couple of years ago, in fact, and I got a phone call from a young lady who was a niece of my wife, and she told me that she knew I was working on the book. She said, William Buckley is being interviewed right now on PBS by David Frost. I said, thank you very much, and I turned on the television, and I caught about 2/3 of the interview. At the end of it, they said you could send away for the transcript, so I did. So I got the transcript, and I read it very carefully. Now, during the interview, David Frost says to William Buckley, he said, I understand that in the first couple of years, you lost somewhere in the order of $19 million getting the magazine started. And Buckley said, yeah, that's true, yes. Well, he said, well, how did you make up the $19 million? From your own personal fortune? And Buck said, oh, no. A couple of speech honoraria, that's all. And they dropped it. No more questions about that. $19 million in 1957. What would that be in today's dollars? Well over 100 million, maybe 150 million. Right? So where did it come from? Well, I don't know for sure, but I know this, that a former high official of the CIA, who was never really part of National Review, at least not obviously, is a man named Thomas Braden. And Thomas Braden said that the section that he had control of in the CIA had set up 20 dummy foundations to fund publications and organizations that they wanted to without the government of the United States being known as the funder, including the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, including a magazine called The Communist. They had financed socialists in Europe, socialist labor unions and labor leaders in Europe and in the United States. And Braden is admitting all of this. He wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post entitled, I'm glad the CIA was immoral. Would it have made sense for the CIA, led by Council on Foreign Relations people who are putting down the notion of conspiracy, who are leading people astray, who are leading them down some primrose path, would it have made sense for the CIA to fund National Review magazine because they knew where it would go and they knew what it would do to so many otherwise thinking Americans? It certainly did make sense, didn't it? Did it have? I can't prove it. I don't know for certain. But I certainly have my suspicions, and so did Murray Rothbard, whom I became quite friendly with before he passed away. Murray Rothbard, as I said before, once said, I think the CIA is in charge of National Review. I think National Review is entirely a CIA operation, is the way he put it. Now, as you know from seeing the poster and the book itself, the subtitle of my book is Pied Piper for the Establishment. I don't think there's anybody in America that I have to explain what I meant by Pied Piper, right? Lead people along. But what about the establishment? What does that mean? Well, here we are in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I remember reading a columnist who appeared in this newspaper during the 60s, a woman named Edith Kermit Roosevelt, who was the granddaughter of Teddy Roosevelt, and herself quite a constitutional conservative. And in one of her columns in 1961, she defined the term establishment. I've never seen it done better. I'm going to read a portion of what she said. The word establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and professions. They make themselves felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or State Department job. They affect the nation's policies in almost every area. They claim that the best way to fight communism is by a one-world socialist state governed by experts like themselves. The result has been policies which favor the growth of the superstate and gradual surrender of United States sovereignty to the United Nations. That's neoconservatism, isn't it? just like I said before. And that's exactly what Buckley stated in that Commonweal article back in 1952, in different words, of course. The establishment, that's what it is. And so there's a whole chapter in the book about the establishment and William Buckley. In 1974, William Buckley published in his National Review magazine his delight at being welcomed into membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, many Americans have come to be aware of what the Council on Foreign Relations stands for. An organization that began in 1921, founded by a man named Edward Mandell House, who had written a book in which he called for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Explicitly, he stated that. Wanted to do away with the constitutional safeguards we had. Wanted a constitutional convention. Wanted an income tax, which they got during the Wilson administration. Wanted the Federal Reserve System, even though they didn't call it that. They wanted a central bank, and they got it, and so on. And so William Buckley, even during that period, joining the Council on Foreign Relations, alerted many of his readers to the fact that he was now part of what they thought they were opposing by being a reader of National Review magazine. And he lost some subscribers before it, but he didn't care at this point. All during these years, William Buckley used every opportunity he could to be snide about the John Birch Society and to kind of laugh it off as not being worthy of your time, or the screwballs in the John Birch Society, or that crazy Robert Welsh, or something like that. And ladies and gentlemen, he literally kept millions of Americans from taking a look at what we have to say. And we aren't commanding anybody to agree with us, but we are asking people to take a look at what we have to say. And I think that maybe the TV camera can show you that we have a website here, we have an address, we're in Appleton, Wisconsin, we're glad to hear from anybody. Now, among the establishment figures in our country, I think names that would come immediately to mind might be Henry Kissinger, or the late Nelson Rockefeller, the whole Rockefeller family. Of course, David Rockefeller, during these years, was the chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. But Buckley, at one point, recommended Kissinger for President of the United States. At another point, he recommended Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, for Secretary of Defense. Right? So, I mean, the man's claim to continue to be a conservative just didn't stand up. But the leftists kept saying that he is the spokesman for the conservative movement. He is the responsible conservative. I surprised somebody recently when I told them, I said, it will probably come as a surprise to you that the man who introduced Henry Kissinger to Richard Nixon was William Buckley. William Buckley was a friend of Henry Kissinger long before Nixon knew him. Then he became friendly when Kissinger was a director of an institute at Harvard University working under a Rockefeller Foundation grant and publishing a magazine called Confluence that was being looked at by the Defense Department of the United States because it was so pro-communist. But Kissinger would arrange for seminars for the students at Harvard, and he would always have Buckley come and participate in his seminars, way back in the early 50s, in the mid-50s, about the time that the magazine National Review was started. And so Kissinger and Buckley have been like that for almost a half a century. One of the most significant achievements, if you want to call it an achievement, of Mr. Buckley was to put down the notion of conspiracy. There was a great line written by a man I've known for a few years ago. He said, "The first job of a conspiracy is to convince the world it does not exist." That's very telling, and it's true. The first job is to convince the world that there is no such thing as a conspiracy. But what is a conspiracy? What do we mean by it in the John Birch Society? There are three elements to conspiracy. First of all, more than one person. Second, secrecy. And third, evil. You got to have all three. If you don't have all three, then you might have a secret network, Or you might have plans for somebody having a birthday party that they didn't want everybody to know that they had reached some plateau in age, right? You could call it a conspiracy, but it's not evil. So what we're talking about here is a group of people who are working secretly to take control of the world and to build a one-world tyranny. There are people who don't like the word conspiracy. Well, okay, then just think of deliberate action. Right? That'll do it. The people who don't like the word conspiracy didn't mind it when they were talking about the Watergate conspiracy or the Iran-Contra conspiracy, right? Or they don't mind if you talk about the mafia. That's a conspiracy, and some other things. Well, why not a conspiracy to take control of the world? And what has happened here is, if you want to take a look at recent history, you will see our nation continuing to involve itself in internationalism and socialism at home, more and more. The day will come, if it's not stopped and reversed, when we lose our freedoms. Very simple. And we're not going to lose it to anything other than a one-world socialist system. But let me also mention that there are very few conspirators. There are many, many people who do the work of a conspiracy, and they do it for personal aggrandizement. If, as a conspiracy, you've seized great influence and maybe great wealth, and you have that at your disposal, you can get a lot of people to do your will who aren't themselves conspirators, but they don't even care. They don't even care. Anybody who's read the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, the founding document of our organization, would find in Chapter 3 a wonderful discussion by Robert Welsh about what he called the amoral man, the man who puts aside all concepts of right and wrong and whose sole goal in life is to promote himself. Never mind anything else, just promote self, and out go the Ten Commandments and out go the constitutional limitations on government. Thank you. I have to apologize for a raspy throat here. I'm sorry. Well, all of this is in my book and so much more. Also, my own personal history, which I've touched very briefly on. Let me go back to the way we started. What are some of the positions that William Buckley has taken? Wage and price controls, compulsory funding of education, foreign aid, United Nations, a new constitutional convention to get rid of the limitations on government, gun control, Genocide Convention, Panama Canal giveaway, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, writing for slick girly magazines, defending pornography, calling on the Catholic Church to relax abortion prohibitions. He has substituted an undefined and constantly shifting leftward conservatism for the real standard for Americans, the Constitution of the United States. And that has to be known. Well, let's wind up the formal part of this, and then maybe we can take a few questions from you. What about the John Birch Society? Ladies and gentlemen, America is up against an organized evil, a conspiracy. The way to oppose organization is with organization. In America, we're in a situation where we can't count on the leadership we have today. There are some good congressmen, there are some good senators, not enough. We need more. So what is needed is not appeals to the wafflers and the go along at any price types. What is needed is a bottom-up revolution. What is needed is the people in the cities and towns, communities across this nation to get themselves informed, to inform their neighbors, their friends about where our country's going so that things will change. And when there are enough people who know and are willing to speak out about things, then all kinds of congressmen who are wafflers will waffle this way instead of that way. And they will become staunch defenders of the Constitution. They will become staunch defenders of independence for the United States. Get us out of the United Nations will become their cry, as it is increasingly becoming the cry of many, many more Americans. Most congressmen are not conspirators. Most would support the Constitution if pressed to do so. Their goal is to stay in office. Well, the John Birch Society's been in business now over 40 years, and sometimes people say to us, what have you accomplished? Ladies and gentlemen, we've accomplished holding together this country. We've accomplished holding on, building a base of understanding so that the people who want to bring us into world government and socialism have not been able to do so. Our Get Us Out campaign has reached millions. We have made the United Nations controversial. And I should point out to you that the big problem we have in the United Nations is not that the UN is taking over. The problem is our country is being delivered to the United Nations. Kofi Annan isn't the biggest problem, our own leaders are. They now send us into war, and they go consistently, one after another, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Somalia, Haiti, and so on. They go to the United Nations for authorization. One of my colleagues came out with a great line not too long ago. He said, one seeks authorization from a superior, not an inferior. If we seek authorization for war to the United Nations, aren't we saying, in effect, they are our superior? That's intolerable. The Constitution says Congress, and Congress alone, has the power to declare war. But the President has assumed this power, and Congress has allowed it. So what has the John Birch Society accomplished? Well, principles stand for America. We found that the Washington Post went ahead and said that the John Birch Society bears a lot of the responsibility for the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Yeah, the Washington Post. They're no friends of ours, but they said that. There have been several high officials appointed to government posts, and we've been able to stop that by simply alerting the proper senators and congressmen to say, no, don't let this guy pass. Don't let this guy go through. The principles stand for America. Tens of millions of items, books, pamphlets, magazines, films, videos, speakers, and all we say to any American, as I'll say to anybody here or anybody watching through the magic of television, just take a look at what we have to say. And I think you'll find, if you really do have red, white, and blue in you, you'll find that what we have said is important and needed. And maybe you'll say to yourself, it's time I got involved, it's time I joined the John Birch Society. That would be wonderful. And we want very many more Americans to make that stand. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's an introduction to my book, the William F. Buckley Jr. Pied Piper for the Establishment. If any of you would like for me to autograph it after the program's over, I'd be glad to do so. Thank you very much.
Mr. McManus will return very briefly to answer some questions that you've already written down. I'll put them right here, Mr. McManus. And please, after the talk, as Mr. McManus mentioned, copies of the book will be available. He'll be happy to autograph them. By the way, if you're watching this on C-SPAN around the country, our website is www.jbs.org, and you can access our American Opinion bookstore and look up this book, get a copy of the book online. Mr. McManus?
In your opinion, what is the single most damaging thing that Buckley has committed? Well, I think I've dwelled on that to some degree. I think his single worst contribution is to set himself up as the arbiter of what the American people should think, when the standard for what the people should think is the Constitution of the United States. He does not support the Constitution. You will not find. Question, did Buckley ever admit that a conspiracy exists? Once or twice in 50 years, he has said that there was a conspiracy centered in Moscow. Just once or twice. And somebody probably told him after he'd said that you shouldn't even use the word conspiracy. The real story, of course, is that Moscow was always a branch office, Moscow being financed by your tax dollars and mine, and so on. At a very time when he was ranting against conspiracy, about a year after the magazine started, this would be in the early fall of 1956, he came out and he said that people do not act according to conspiracy. They instead act, and I'm quoting here, spontaneously, not in compliance with a continually imposed discipline. He said that. At the very time he was saying that, or just weeks before, a fellow named J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, had written an article in the Elks magazine, and I've used this so often I can quote it by heart. He said, "Yet the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists." So, ladies and gentlemen, J. Edgar Hoover or William Buckley, right? What's your choice? What do you think of our new Homeland Security Department? Well, that's a little bit off the subject of the book, but I think it's extremely dangerous. I wish that our nation would not get involved in this. I think it's a tremendous invasion of personal liberty and private property and so on, and I'm very concerned about it. What else we got here? What was Buckley's relationship with Henry Kissinger? Well, we've already talked about that. I guess somebody wrote that before I got to it. Why write a book about William Buckley? Isn't he a has-been? He is 77 years old, ladies and gentlemen, and in many ways he is winding down. But as I mentioned in the book is written in part as a warning to be on guard for others like that. And who might some of those others be? Neoconservatives pushing the same kind of stuff. Rush Limbaugh, William Kristol, son of Irving, now the head of the magazine called the Weekly Standard. One of my friends calls it the Weak Need Standard. Right? William Bennett, and unfortunately, Mr. Bush, the White House right now. So-called conservative leaders. You say Buckley spread lies about the John Birch Society. What lies? Well, that's a good question because it's very easy to answer. During the Vietnam War, we had our Get Us Out of the United Nations campaign going, and the bumper stickers that we had back then and the signs and everything didn't have the of the United Nations on them. It just said, "Get us out," and we wanted people to ask it, get U.S. out, what's it all? We wanted people to ask us, So Buckley came out in his magazine, and it was mostly James Burnham, saying the John Birch Society's slogan, "Get us out," is "Get us out of Vietnam." It never was, not even close. The attitude the Birch Society had about Vietnam was, we never should have gotten involved in the first place, but now that we're there, the only honorable way out is to win the war, and that can be accomplished by taking the troops out and starving the enemy. It was a very simple solution. So there was a monstrous lie being told. Have others denounced William Buckley besides yourself? Well, if you've seen the book, the back cover has quotations from Medford Evans, Kevin Phillips, L. Brent Bozell, General Thomas Lane, Murray Rothbard, Don Fetter, and there's an entire chapter in there about former friends and allies denouncing Mr. Buckley. One of the first that I led off with was the group that he formed, the Young Americans for Freedom. In 1977, they had a convention, and they had hundreds of young college-age youngsters all over the country come to their convention, and they denounced William Buckley, who was there. And Buckley rubbed salt in the wounds by bringing Kissinger along with him and demanding that he be able to speak, because Buckley had started the Young Americans for Freedom. L. Brent Bozell and Dr. Charles Rice founded Triumph magazine. Was Buckley involved? What about Triumph magazine? Triumph magazine was an intellectual Catholic publication that began in the 70s. L. Brent Bozell, already disassociated from Buckley completely, was the main force behind it. I think Charles Rice was part of it as well. But it only lasted about 4 or 5 years, and then it went out of business. And Buckley was never involved in that. Anything substantial regarding the Catholic Church, you wouldn't have found him there. What does Buckley say about his time in the CIA? Well, that's interesting. Now, he said, first of all, that he was operating in deep cover, and he said that in several columns and in a couple of his books. Now, if you know anything about Buckley, you know that he's probably written 50, 60 books, many of them spy novels, and the chief character in the spy novels is a man named Blackford Oakes. And Blackford Oakes' career is very much the same as Buckley's, He went into the CIA for reasons other than wanting to be CIA, to avoid the draft and so on. And many of those novels have what might be called X or R-rated material in them. And they have helped to drive down the moral fiber of our country. But Buckley does not talk about his role in the CIA, and I don't think he's allowed to. I suspect that once you're in the CIA and you're involved in some sort of deep cover, then you don't talk about it. He did at one point say that he was involved in trying to keep, excuse me, some student groups in Mexico from being leftist. I don't know. Here's a question. I asked to post a notice of a JBS meeting at my local public library and was told postings could only be permitted to nonprofit organizations. What part of JBS is nonprofit? We haven't made a profit in 42 years. This is a very interesting question because we make a distinction. The John Birch Society was founded and based in Massachusetts, Belmont, Massachusetts, a suburb. Now, the headquarters now is in Appleton, Wisconsin, since 1989. So it's chartered under the laws of the state of Massachusetts in the educational nonprofit section. So it's chartered as an educational nonprofit organization in the state of Massachusetts. And anybody who runs into this kind of problem can get a document from our headquarters that certainly certifies that we are indeed a nonprofit organization. But the interesting thing about it is the John Birch Society has never applied to the IRS for tax-exempt status, which we could get because we are a nonprofit educational organization, perfectly legitimate. But Robert Welsh had studied all kinds of organizations that had failed, that were nonprofit, and all of a sudden, because they were stepping on the toes of some government agency or whatever, had their nonprofit status taken away from them and were forced out of business. Robert Welsh said at the founding of the society, we do not intend to serve at the pleasure of the United States government. Brilliant. A brilliant move. So we have never had the tax-exempt status, which means that the funds we raise and the all of the activities that we sponsor are paid for with money that people give us and do not write it off on their taxes. Right? Thank God for them. Thank God for them. To keep me in the luxurious life that I've been accustomed to for all these years. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's some good questions there. Thank you very much. God bless America.
John McManus is president of the John Birch Society, which published his book, William F. Buckley Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment. Visit jbs.org for more information.